In the words of Michael Jordan,
Stop it. Get some help.
Ours is a generation filled with questions that need answers that we seem to not have access to, and yet no other generation has had this much access to information so readily available. We want to know if we're missing out on anything, and if so, how much. We want to know if we're normal enough, and if not, then why am I not normal? We just want to know if people genuinely like eating broccoli, because as far as we're concerned, everyone could just be pretending to like that stuff. We want to know if we're okay and what is biting us, apparently. But all in all, we are curious individuals that have been granted platforms where we can ask all these troubling questions and get answers from people from different walks of life. Questions that we so often have no one to ask, and if we do, they may be deemed as too odd or weird. But online, we can pose these questions under pseudonyms and find like-minded people that we can have conversations with about these things without being subjected to extreme judgment. And so with the growth of mental health awareness and the amount of time people had during the pandemic, a lot of focus went on our thoughts, behaviors, patterns, and our interactions with other people. Things that were once hidden due to our focus on more quote-unquote bigger things as a result of living in a fast-paced world were being brought to the surface, making us even more curious. And so we continued to make even more Google searches trying to find answers as to why we act in ways that may come off as odd to others around us. Do we have any underlying mental health issues? Do we have a particular mental illness if we resonate with 2 or 3 but not all symptoms of a said mental illness? How do we know if we're not faking our mental illnesses? Nowadays, there are thousands of videos about mental health on YouTube and even more on TikTok, making discussions on mental health more normalized in today's society, although not everywhere still, and information on mental health more readily available than ever before. People can now easily learn about symptoms of a particular mental illness through a 30-second TikTok video and go to consult a mental health profession when they feel that they resonate with what they heard about. But the truth of the matter is this: not everyone that relates to these videos goes out to seek professional advice. And I believe that one of the main reasons for this is that this information is especially available to younger people that don't have the support they need to actually go out and get checked on by a mental health professional. Because if you grew up in a religious home like me, you're most likely to be dismissed for coming forward with claims of possibly having mental health challenges, and that you should instead just pray about it. Because truth be told, it's hard to convince someone, a parent, of your sufferings when they don't believe in the existence of your so-called, well, sufferings. And the fact that professional help like therapy is very expensive does not make things any easier. And so what do? Say it with me, kids. Yes, we self-diagnose. According to highlandspringclinic.org, self-diagnosis is defined as the process of diagnosing or identifying a medical condition in yourself. According to Wikipedia, this may be assisted by medical dictionaries, books, resources on the internet, past personal experiences, or as in the age of social media, after watching a 30-second TikTok video that briefly lists some symptoms of a mental illness. According to Mental Health America, mental illnesses are defined as brain-based conditions that affect thinking, emotions, and behaviors, and that since we all have brains, having some kind of mental health problem during our lives is really common. Now, there is a number of reasons as to why there has been a rise in the number of people self-diagnosing now more than ever. With more and more people creating content about mental illnesses, it has been found that it's very easy to confuse normal day-to-day feelings such as sorrow and restlessness with serious conditions like depression and ADHD, because sometimes most of these sources will just mention 1 or 2 things that you may end up resonating with. In an article published by counselingtoday.org, author Lindsay Phillips writes that someone may see a video about how controlling behavior and manipulation are traits of narcissistic personality disorder and fear that they have the disorder because they engaged in this type of behavior in a past relationship. They might have been upset and accused their partner of not loving them, for instance. Making such a statement can be a form of manipulation used by someone with narcissistic personality disorder. But again, this is also something many people who don't have the disorder might blurt out in the heat of the moment. Jumping to conclusions about your mental well-being can also come as a result of fear of having to actually open up about your internal sufferings. This fear is especially worse among those whose concerns for their mental well-being have been dismissed before. When something like that has happened, it can be a little hard to find the confidence to actually talk to someone about what you're going through internally. Because unlike physical conditions which usually manifest manifest themselves outwardly, mental conditions go unnoticed more often than not by others around you, and only you know what demons you fight within. And so opening up to someone can feel like risking being told you're just being dramatic and delusional. Another reason as to why a lot of people are turning to self-diagnosis is that it helps to put a label on something that might have been the bane of your existence for a very long time. It helps to make sense of things and to no longer swim in the pool of uncertainty. Finally, attaching a name to that thing that you've been heavily criticized and judged for brings a sense of relief. After a long time of asking yourself, what's wrong with me, over and over again, everything finally begins to make sense. In a way, self-diagnosing gives a certain sense of validation, and I especially resonate with this reason because my fair share of having this hunger for answers was as a result of having a hard time working through my own emotions and feelings due to an intense fear of having a compromised judgment when trying to validate my own internal sufferings. In other words, I was, and still am to an extent, scared that I was being dramatic for crying or feeling a certain type of way about something. I don't know, but I guess you could say that I wanted to know, like, am I overreacting, or is what I'm feeling normal? Or I guess you could say justifiable. And so with this desire to kind of like figure out the scale of how valid my emotions are, I, like a lot of people, decided to turn to the internet and start asking Google questions like, am I normal? LMAO, like Google's want to know. And I've thought about it a couple of times, and I still can't figure out why I just have this urge and need to just want to know if my emotions are valid. And it's like, maybe I'm scared of basing the justifications of my internal sufferings on a compromised judgment, but again, it's like, why do I need my internal sufferings justified, you know? And so after doing some much needed quote-unquote research on those teary nights as to why I feel like such a piece of doo-doo, I came across a social disorder that worked well enough at giving me the sense of validation I very much wanted and needed. The said disorder being AVPD, which is short for Avoidant Personality Disorder, and my goodness was it gratifying, even though it did feel a little bit scary, to be honest. According to CNN, it is believed by some experts that people who self-diagnose mental conditions, especially teenagers, may be over-identifying with a specific label or diagnosis, and that a diagnosis can be used as a shield or justification of behavior in social situations. With the mounting pressure that young people face to be socially competitive, those teens with more significant insecurities may feel that they will never measure up. And my goodness, did they hit the nail on the head. And see, this is the part where I get a little uncomfortable, because why are they exposing me like this? When they talk of using a diagnosis as a justification, I immediately think of complacency. My own version would be this hole of self-pity and helplessness that I ended up digging for myself after identifying with a specific disorder. This whole mentality of, I guess I'll have to see a therapist, until then, I guess this is it. For someone who hates complacency, it was a little unsettling to come to these realizations that maybe I'm trying so hard to stand by this newfound discovery of mine so I could relieve myself of having to take responsibility for my own actions in a certain area of my life. The irony though is that even as I'm saying this right now, I'm getting this strong urge to get my phone and Google if really I do pity myself, and if so, why? At the end of the day, we as young people are just looking for answers, and we're more often than not resorting to the easiest way we can get our hands on them in order to satisfy this ever-growing hunger within us, trying to understand why we are the way we are, and if we're doomed, how much on a scale of 1 to 10. But again, this too, like most things, comes with its own consequences. Now, the year is 2023, and the amount of people on social media, especially TikTok, giving mental health advice is just crazy. And while some are qualified for this, some, well, not so much. Because of this, social media ends up blurring the line between what is a mental illness and what isn't, which then leads to a spread of misinformation. This, in turn, like I had mentioned earlier, leads to people confusing normal emotions with mental disorders. Not forgetting the fact that people are now faking mental conditions for clout, living us even more easily prone to misinformation. Also, self-diagnosis in of itself is heavily flawed. If anything, it is barely even a diagnosis. Diagnoses are complex and can be difficult to identify correctly because in order for a diagnosis to be made, a trusted and well-trained mental health professional has to carry out assessments before jumping to any diagnostic conclusions. Things like a person's medical history, physical examination, and possibly lab tests if it is thought that another medical condition is the source of the symptoms have to be taken into consideration. On top of that, a psychological evaluation is conducted by asking questions about the patient's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Also, the severity of the symptoms, the degree to which they are distressing and interfering with everyday functioning, the risk and the advantages of current treatments, as well as other criteria, all play a role in determining whether or not treatment is necessary. And so it becomes a very big concern when a person makes a self-diagnosis and begins to find ways to manage how the illness affects their life without any professional guidance. Because really, whether we're willing to admit it or not, when it comes to mental health and just health in general, we can't just be a micros and read about stuff and become pros without doing any proper training and expect to save ourselves. It is also a bit of a pickle when after a person self-diagnoses, they go out to seek professional help, and after assessments are done, they refuse to accept that what they had diagnosed themselves with was actually inaccurate and that maybe, just maybe, they don't even have a mental illness. And as a self-diagnosing individual myself, I understand how that can be a little bit hard to grasp, especially when you've gone on for a while thinking you actually do have a mental illness or two and have come to accept the situation after your findings, especially when the self-diagnosed illness makes you feel validated in any way. And so whilst doing research about mental illness and the like, it is very important that we don't jump to any conclusions without seeking out professional advice. It's so easy to get lost in a Google hole and start relating with every symptom you see, causing you to spiral into increased anxiety and possibly panic. That is why, although a difficult decision to make, you can see a trusted mental health professional who can walk you through these things with the much needed care. In conclusion, whilst results from self-diagnosing don't always prove to be wrong, it is always safer to seek out professional advice on your findings. And while self-diagnosing is heavily discouraged and frowned upon, doing your own personal research on mental illnesses is not discouraged. The problem comes in when we begin to jump to conclusions after relating to what we're sensitizing ourselves on. We also ought to be mindful of where we're getting information from on the internet. I mean, people pretending to have mental illnesses and posing as mental health professionals to gain a following online is literally no joke. It's very easy to get misinformed and panic over something that's not true. That is why it is suggested that when looking for reliable information on the internet, try utilizing sites that end with .gov as they are sponsored by the federal government, those ending with .edu as they are maintained by medical schools or universities, and those ending with .org as they are maintained by non-profit organizations. But at the end of the day, a question comes in as to what we should do instead. Like, no really, what should we do? I've read a bunch of articles and stuff on sites telling young people to stop self-diagnosing and to instead get some professional help. But what if you don't have access to professional help or support groups? I mean, the hunger for answers is there, and the source for possible answers, which is the internet, is there. But how do we access definite answers in order to find ways to get better? What about people that have it really, really hard? Well, I've decided to pose this question for you guys. I know, some of you are like, oh my god, girl, are you giving us homework? But no, really, I feel like who better to help than the people who have been in these similar situations and have worked their way out. However, some possible solutions will be on the screen, but as a generation hungry for answers, one thing for sure is that the questions never seem to stop. There is always something. And so for this reason, I am more than happy to inform you that the Mental Health America website has online screening tools in form of mental health tests that you can take if you're trying to look into any potential symptoms of a mental condition. But again, as I've mentioned a gazillion times already, these are not to be substituted with an actual diagnosis made by a professional. After taking the test, you're highly encouraged to share the results of the test with a physician or healthcare provider. But all in all, it's a very good source for learning about mental health and mental illnesses. The link to the Mental Health America website will be in the description box below, along with other trustworthy sources for anyone looking to read more about mental health and mental illnesses. Oh, and most importantly, warm lines for anyone in need of talking to a professional will be there as well. And so to end this video off on a lighter note, a reminder that the world is not all grey and doom, a meme from my weekly collection. Thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more future content. Oh, and comment down below any thoughts or ideas that you may have as a little interactive safe space. Remember to keep all comments respectful and to follow the community guidelines. And with all that has been said, I will see you guys in my next video. Until then, stay safe and drink lots of water because it's good for your health.
Some days I stay up until 3 a.m. I walk with the 3 like Mercedes-Benz. I feel like my whole life I don't play pretend. I trust God with my future plans, even though my kin don't really understand.